Texas, May 1945. The pre-dawn air hung heavy with mesquite and dust as three figures slipped through a cut fence at Camp Mexia. The wire sang softly in the wind. Coyotes called from somewhere in the darkness. The Texas plains stretched endlessly south toward Mexico, 200 miles of nothing but heat and sky. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, a 41-year-old schoolteacher from Osaka, led two others into the night. His uniform was faded, his hands steady despite 3 years of captivity. He had taught children poetry once. Now he was running toward a border he'd never reach. They had been told Americans were savages. That capture meant torture, humiliation, death without honor. But 40 miles north, a weathered rancher named Jack Morrison saddled his horse in silence. His son David had died at Okinawa 3 months earlier. The telegram still sat on the kitchen table. Now he was riding out to hunt the men who looked like his son's killers, expected to bring them back, expected to hate them. By noon, the escapees were dying. The sun rose like a hammer. Water ran out. The youngest, Private Nakamura, collapsed in the dust, his lips cracked and bleeding. When Jack found them at a dried creek bed, his son Billy raised a rifle, tears and rage in his eyes, ready to deliver the justice everyone said they deserved. Jack lowered the barrel, dismounted, walked to the enemy and offered water from his own canteen. Yamamoto took it, hands shaking, unable to understand the kindness. He had expected bullets, not mercy, had prepared for death, not this quiet cowboy who knelt in the dirt beside a dying Japanese soldier and said simply, "Drink slow." In that moment, everything they'd been told about each other began to crack. Jack had buried his son. Yamamoto hadn't seen his daughter in 4 years. Both men were fathers. Both were drowning in a war that had made enemies of strangers who might have been friends. The ride back to camp would take 3 days, long enough for hate to become something harder to sustain, long enough for propaganda to collide with the uncomfortable truth that the enemy bleeds the same, grieves the same, hopes for the same mercy we all hope for when the world stops making sense. Jack whispered to himself, almost in prayer, "David, I hope I'm doing right by you." He wasn't sure anymore what right even meant. Before we continue, hit subscribe for more buried stories where history chose the simple narrative over the complicated truth, and drop a comment with your city and time. We're fascinated by where these untold accounts reach across the world. Texas, May 1945. The wire sang in the darkness as 3 men slipped through the cut fence at Camp Mexia, their boots making no sound on the packed earth. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto moved first, his body tense with purpose, followed by Corporal Kenji Ito and the youngest, Private Hiro Nakamura, whose hands trembled as he clutched a canvas bag of saved rations. The guard towers stood, silent behind them, their searchlights sweeping lazy arcs across empty ground. The war in Europe had ended 2 weeks earlier. Japan's surrender felt inevitable now, a matter of weeks, maybe days. But surrender meant dishonor worse than death, and Yamamoto had made his choice. Mexico lay 200 miles south, across an expanse of Texas that looked flat and manageable on the stolen map he'd studied for months. What the map didn't show was the brutal arithmetic of heat and distance, the way Texas swallows men who don't respect it, the fact that in this landscape there's nowhere to hide when the sun comes up. They walked through mesquite and prickly pear, guided by stars Yamamoto had learned to read from a book in the camp library. The night air was cool, almost kind, and for the first 3 hours everything went according to plan. Ito moved with a farmer's steady endurance, his breathing quiet and controlled. Nakamura struggled more, his city-soft feet already blistering in boots that didn't quite fit, but he pushed forward without complaint, driven by the same desperate logic that had launched this escape. They were officers and soldiers of the Emperor. They could not simply wait in a cage for peace to rob them of meaning. Better to die free under open sky than live as men who had given up. By the time the eastern horizon began to pale, they'd covered maybe 12 miles. Yamamoto allowed himself a moment of hope. Then the sun rose and Texas showed its teeth. The heat came fast and absolute, climbing from the low 80s at dawn to near 100 by mid-morning. The land they'd crossed in cool darkness now stretched before them like a furnace, shimmering and merciless. Water became everything. They'd brought 3 canteens, carefully rationed, but Yamamoto realized within an hour they'd miscalculated badly. The map showed a creek 15 miles south. They pressed toward it, their pace slowing as the sun climbed higher. Nakamura began to lag, his face flushed and wet, his breathing shallow. Ito took the young man's pack without a word, distributing its weight between himself and Yamamoto. They reached the creek at noon and found it bone dry, just cracked mud and the white skeletons of catfish that had died months ago. Yamamoto's hope died with them. They had perhaps a half canteen of water left between 3 men, and the nearest town was another 20 miles. Mexico might as well have been on the moon. Nakamura collapsed an hour later, just stopped walking and sat down hard in the dust, his eyes unfocused and glassy. Heat stroke, Yamamoto recognized immediately. They tried to shade him with their bodies, gave him the last of the water, but his skin was burning and his pulse raced like a terrified bird. Ito looked at Yamamoto with a question in his eyes neither man wanted to ask. "Do we leave him? Do we all die here together?" Yamamoto made the only choice he could live with. They would carry Nakamura as far as possible, and when they could, carry him no more. They would wait for whatever came next. Death, probably. Capture if they were unlucky enough to be found before dehydration finished them. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from mesquite branches and Ito's shirt and began the slow, agonizing process of hauling their unconscious comrade across land that wanted them dead. 40 miles north, Jack Morrison saddled his horse in the pre-dawn darkness of his barn, his movements automatic after 50 years of the same ritual. His surviving son Billy stood beside him, already mounted, his jaw set and his eyes hard. The call had come at 4 in the morning. 3 Japanese prisoners had escaped from Camp Mexia. Search parties were forming. Jack had tried to refuse, claiming age and the need to work his cattle, but the deputy had been insistent. They needed trackers, and Jack Morrison was the best in 3 counties. So here he was, riding out to hunt men he had no desire to find, accompanied by a son whose rage at all things Japanese had curdled into something toxic and frightening. Billy hadn't been the same since the telegram about David arrived 3 months ago. The boy who'd once been gentle with injured animals and patient with younger children had hardened into someone Jack barely recognized, someone who spoke constantly of revenge and justice and making them pay, whoever them happened to be that day. They met the main search party at the camp gates as the sun cleared the horizon. 12 men on horseback plus 2 bloodhounds straining at their leads. The camp commander, a tired-looking major with circles under his eyes, briefed them quickly. 3 prisoners, all officers, cut through the wire sometime after midnight, probably headed south toward Mexico. Dangerous men, he said, though Jack noted the way the major's voice lacked conviction on that last part. These weren't hardened killers fresh from Iwo Jima. These were men who'd been in captivity for years, teachers and farmers and clerks who'd had the profound misfortune of being on the losing side of someone else's war. Still, orders were orders, and Jack had never been one to shirk duty. They rode south in a loose formation, the dogs working the scent trail through mesquite and scrub. The land opened before them, vast and indifferent and beautiful in the hard morning light. Billy rode with his rifle across his saddle, his knuckles white on the stock, and Jack found himself praying to a God he only half believed in that they'd find these men already dead from the heat, sparing everyone the complications that would come from finding them alive. They found the escapees at 2 in the afternoon in a dried creek bed where cottonwood skeletons cast thin shadows that offered no real relief from the sun. The bloodhounds caught the scent a quarter-mile out and went wild, baying and straining against their handlers. Jack saw them before the others did. 3 dark shapes huddled in what little shade existed, one lying flat and motionless, the other 2 kneeling beside him. Billy saw them in the same instant and spurred his horse forward, rifle already coming up to his shoulder. Jack kicked his own mount hard and cut Billy off, his horse shouldering into his son's with enough force to spoil the shot. The rifle barked anyway, the bullet whining off into empty air. The sound echoed across the flats like judgment. The two conscious prisoners looked up, their faces hollow with exhaustion and resignation. The older one, a lieutenant by the insignia still visible on his faded uniform, stood slowly and raised his hands. He said something in Japanese, his voice cracked and dusty. The other prisoner, shorter and broader through the shoulders, stayed kneeling beside the third man, his body positioned as if to shield his fallen comrade, even though he had no weapon and no hope. Billy was screaming now, incoherent with rage and grief, trying to wheel his horse around Jack's for a clear shot. Jack grabbed his son's reins and held them, his own voice low and steady. "Not like this," he said. Billy's face was wet with tears and red with fury. "They killed David," he choked out. "They deserve to die here." "Maybe they do," Jack said quietly, meeting his son's eyes and holding them. "But we ain't killers. Not today." The moment stretched like hot wire. The rest of the search party had caught up now, forming a loose semicircle around the creek bed, rifles ready but not aimed, waiting to see how this would play. Jack could feel their eyes on him, could sense Billy's betrayal and confusion, could hear in the silence all the things they'd say later about Jack Morrison going soft, about choosing Japs over his own blood. He dismounted anyway, his knees protesting after hours in the saddle, and walked down into the creek bed. The standing prisoner tensed but didn't move, his hands still raised, his eyes following Jack's every step with the wary intelligence of a man who'd learned to read violence before it arrived. Jack stopped 3 feet away and pulled his canteen from his belt. The prisoner stared at it like it was something from a dream. Jack held it out. The man took it with shaking hands, unscrewed the cap, and drank 3 long swallows before forcing himself to stop. He lowered the canteen and met Jack's eyes, and something passed between them that had no words in any language. Then the prisoner turned and knelt beside the unconscious young man, tilting water carefully into his mouth. The boy choked and coughed, but some of it went down. His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Jack knelt too, his old rancher's knees finding the hard ground, and put a hand on the boy's forehead. Burning up, he said to no one in particular, "Heat stroke. Bad." He looked at the kneeling prisoner, the quiet one who'd stayed with his comrade. "You speak English?" The man shook his head, but the lieutenant said, "Small bit, yes." Jack nodded. "Your friend needs a doctor. We ride back to camp now, or he dies." The lieutenant translated in quick Japanese. The quiet one replied, his voice barely a whisper. The lieutenant looked at Jack and said something that sounded like gratitude and apology mixed together. "We understand. We come." No fight. Jack stood and called up to Billy, who still sat his horse with the rifle across his saddle and murder in his eyes. "Get down here and help me get this boy on a horse. We're taking them back." Billy didn't move. The betrayal on his face was complete, absolute. "You're choosing them," he said, his voice breaking, "over David, over everything." Jack's own voice was tired, so tired. "I'm choosing what David would have wanted me to be, the kind of man he thought I was." Billy made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, jerked his reins free from Jack's grip, and wheeled his horse around. He rode off 20 yards and stopped, his back to everyone, his shoulders shaking. The rest of the search party sat their horses in uncomfortable silence. Finally, the deputy, a man named Carson, who'd known Jack 30 years, dismounted and came down into the creek bed. He looked at the 3 prisoners, at Jack, and nodded once. "Let's get them loaded up," he said. "We got a long ride back." They rigged the unconscious boy between 2 horses, his arms draped over saddle horns, his body supported by rope and blankets. The lieutenant and the quiet one walked, their hands loosely bound in front of them more for appearance than security. They were in no condition to run, and everyone knew it. Jack led the formation north, back toward Camp Mexia, with Billy riding silent and separate 50 yards ahead. The sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, and the temperature dropped from unbearable to merely oppressive. Jack found himself riding beside the lieutenant, who walked with the straight-back dignity of a man determined not to collapse, even though every step clearly cost him. After an hour of silence, the prisoner spoke. "Thank you," he said in careful English, "for water, for mercy." Jack didn't look at him. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You got a long road ahead, and not everyone back there thinks I did right." The prisoner was quiet for a moment, then said, "My name Yamamoto. Teacher. Before war." Jack glanced at him. "Morrison," he said. "Rancher. Was a father to 2 sons. Now just one." The words hung in the air like smoke. Yamamoto nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "I have daughter," he said. "Osaka. Not see 4-year. Not know if alive." The admission was quiet, almost private, as if confessing to the sky rather than to his captor. Jack felt something shift in his chest, some small wall beginning to crack. He didn't want to feel sympathy for this man. It would be so much easier to hate him, to see only the uniform and the enemy flag and the abstract evil that had killed David. But here in the fading heat of a Texas afternoon, walking beside a father who didn't know if his child still breathed, Jack couldn't quite manage it. They were just men, now stripped of flags and causes, reduced to the simple, terrible truth that war devours children and leaves fathers to carry the weight. They walked on in silence as the shadows grew long and the first stars appeared in the eastern sky. Still hours from camp, still uncertain what waited at the end of this journey, but bound together now by something neither of them had words to name. They made camp as darkness fell, still a full day's ride from Camp Mexia, in a shallow draw where a windmill creaked and turned above a stock tank half full of muddy water. The Deputy Carson radioed their position and status to the camp commander, his voice crackling through static about prisoners secured and one requiring medical attention. Jack helped ease the unconscious Nakamura down from the horse, the boy's skin still burning hot despite the cooling night air. They laid him on blankets in the lee of the windmill, and Jack did what he could, which wasn't much beyond keeping him comfortable and trying to get water into him a few drops at a time. Yamamoto and Ito sat nearby, their hands still loosely bound, watching with the helpless concern of men who'd carried their comrade this far and could do nothing more. The other searchers built a small fire and boiled coffee, their conversation low and intermittent, most of them avoiding looking at Jack or the prisoners, unsure what to make of the strange mercy they'd witnessed. Billy sat apart from everyone, his rifle across his knees, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. Jack watched his son and felt the weight of all the things left unsaid between them, all the grief that had curdled into rage because rage at least felt like action, like purpose. He poured 2 cups of coffee and walked over, settling down beside Billy without asking permission. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Billy said, his voice flat and hard, "I don't understand you. David's gone. They killed him, and you give them water like they're neighbors who stop by for help." Jack sipped his coffee, considering his words carefully. "Your brother knew something you haven't learned yet," he said finally. "That hate's the easiest thing in the world. Takes no courage at all. Any fool can hate." Billy's jaw clenched. "So I'm a fool now? For wanting justice?" Jack shook his head. "You're grieving," he said. "That's different. But justice and revenge ain't the same thing, and you're smart enough to know it." Billy was quiet for a moment, then said, "They started it. Pearl Harbor. All of it." Jack nodded. "They did," he said. "And we're ending it. Already ended it in Europe, near about done in the Pacific. Millions dead on both sides, cities burned, families destroyed." He paused, his voice going softer. "But those 3 men down there didn't start this war any more than you or David did. They're just men who got swept up in something bigger than all of us, same as we did." Billy turned to look at his father, his eyes wet in the firelight. "David died alone on some island I can't even pronounce," he said. "Died scared and hurting and probably calling for mama or for home. And you want me to just forgive the people who did that to him?" Jack met his son's eyes and held them. "I want you to understand something I learned too late in my own life," he said, "that the only thing harder than losing someone you love is becoming someone they wouldn't recognize. Your brother was a gentle soul, wouldn't even hunt unless we needed the meat. You think he'd want you carrying this poison around?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Billy looked away first, his throat working. "I don't know what he'd want," he said quietly, I just know he's gone and I'm still here, and that don't seem right. Jack put a hand on his son's shoulder. Nothing about it's right, he said. War makes orphans and widows and leaves the rest of us to figure out how to live with what it took. But we get to choose what we do with that grief. Let it turn us into something hard and mean, or let it teach us to value every life a little more because we know how quick they can be taken. They sat together in silence after that, drinking their coffee while the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Eventually, Billy stood, his movements stiff and reluctant. I still don't like it, he said, but I won't shoot anyone tonight. It was the smallest of concessions, but Jack took it for the gift it was. He woke before dawn to find Yamamoto sitting up beside Nakamura, speaking softly in Japanese while the young man's eyes fluttered half open. Jack came over and knelt, putting a hand on the boy's forehead. Cooler, he said. Fever's breaking. Yamamoto looked at him with something like wonder. You save his life, he said. We all die in desert, but you save. Jack shook his head. Just gave him water, he said. Rest did the work. But Yamamoto persisted, his English halting but determined. You not have to, he said. Could leave us. Easier for you. Why you choose hard way. Jack was quiet for a long moment, watching the sky pale in the east. He thought about David, about the telegram, about all the nights he'd lain awake wondering if his boy had died quick or suffered, if someone had shown him kindness at the end, or if he'd been alone with his fear. Finally, he said, because someone might have done the same for my son. Maybe they did. I'll never know. But I can choose what kind of man I am when it's my turn to show mercy. Yamamoto absorbed this, his face thoughtful in the growing light. Then he said, I teach children before war. Poetry, history, how to think for self. Then government say, teach them to die for emperor. I refuse at first, but they threaten family. So I teach what they want, and children go to war, and I live with shame every day since. He looked at Jack directly. You ask why we escape? Not because we want freedom, because we cannot face peace, knowing what we help to make. Jack understood then the weight this man carried, the way guilt shapes a life more surely than any prison fence. We all got things we wish we'd done different, he said. War makes us choose between bad and worse, then judges us for the choosing. Best we can do is try to do better when we get another chance. Yamamoto nodded slowly, and they sat together in the dawn quiet, two fathers on opposite sides of a war that was ending, bound by losses they could barely speak about and a strange, unexpected grace that neither had asked for but both desperately needed. By the time the others stirred and the camp came to life, something had shifted. Billy came to help load Nakamura onto the horse without being asked, his movements still stiff but no longer hostile. The quiet prisoner Ito noticed a hawk circling overhead and said something in Japanese that made Yamamoto translate with a small, sad smile. He say the hawk hunt alone, but always return home. He wonder if we ever return home, or if home still exists to return to. Carson overheard and said, almost gently, war's near over now. You'll go home, one way or another. The words were meant as comfort, but carried their own weight of uncertainty. They mounted up as the sun cleared the horizon, turning the Texas landscape gold and red and impossibly vast, and began the long ride north toward whatever waited at the end of this strange journey between enemies who were learning, step by step, mile by mile, that maybe enemy was just a word someone else had taught them, and maybe they could choose to unlearn it. They were 3 hours from Camp Mexia when Ito's horse stumbled in a prairie dog hole and went down hard, throwing its rider clear but landing badly itself with a sound like green wood snapping. The horse thrashed once and lay still, its breathing labored and wrong. Ito had rolled when he hit and come up in a crouch, but something in the way he held his left leg told Jack the man was hurt. Carson dismounted fast and went to check the horse while Jack went to the prisoner. Ito's face was pale beneath the sun-darkened skin, his jaw clenched tight against pain he wouldn't give voice to. Jack knelt and ran careful hands down the man's leg, feeling the wrongness in the shin where bone had broken clean through. Ito made no sound, but his breathing went shallow and quick. Jack looked up at Yamamoto, who'd stopped walking and was watching with alarm. "Tell him it's broken," Jack said. "Tell him I need to set it or it'll heal crooked and he'll walk with a limp the rest of his life." Yamamoto translated quickly, his voice tight with concern. Ito nodded once and lay back in the dust, his hands gripping fistfuls of dry grass. Jack called to Billy to bring the medical kit from his saddlebag and to Carson to find 2 straight pieces of wood for a splint. Then he looked at Ito and said, "This is going to hurt something fierce." The prisoner met his eyes and said something in Japanese that Yamamoto translated as, "I understand. Do what must be done." Jack positioned his hands on either side of the break, feeling the displaced bone beneath his fingers. He'd set breaks before on men and horses both, but it never got easier and he never stopped hating the necessity of causing pain to heal. He looked at Billy, who'd returned with the kit, his face unreadable. "Hold his shoulders down," Jack said. "Don't let him thrash." Billy hesitated only a moment before kneeling and placing his hands firmly on Ito's shoulders, and in that small action Jack saw the first crack in his son's armor of hate. He pulled and twisted in one smooth motion, feeling the bones slide back into alignment, and Ito's body went rigid as a board, his back arching off the ground despite Billy's weight. A sound came from him then, low and animal, bitten off almost before it began. Then it was done, and Ito lay gasping, his face slick with sweat. Jack worked quickly, binding the leg with strips of cloth torn from someone's spare shirt, splinting it with the wood Carson had found, doing everything he could to immobilize it for the rough ride ahead. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and said to Yamamoto, "Tell him he's a brave man." Took that better than most would have. Yamamoto translated, and Ito managed a weak smile, saying something that made Yamamoto laugh quietly despite the circumstances. "He say you have good hands, like his father who was bone setter in his village. He say maybe in different life, we are friends who share sake and talk about weather." The words hit Jack harder than he expected, opening something in his chest he'd kept carefully locked. "Maybe so," he said, and meant it. Carson came back from checking the horse with bad news written on his face. "Got to put her down," he said. "Neck's broke and she's suffering." Jack nodded and stood, pulling his revolver from its holster. He walked to where the horse lay and knelt beside her head, running a hand down her neck, speaking soft words that meant nothing and everything. Then he did what needed doing, the shot echoing flat across the empty land, and came back to find Billy staring at him with something like understanding starting to dawn. "You didn't want to," Billy said quietly, "but you did it anyway because it was right." Jack holstered the gun. "Being a man means doing hard things you don't want to do," he said. "Means choosing what's right over what's easy, even when it costs you." They rigged a travois from mesquite poles and rope, laying Ito on blankets and securing him so the jolting wouldn't shift the brake. Nakamura had improved enough to sit a horse with help, though he swayed in the saddle and his eyes still held the glassy confusion of someone not quite present. They redistributed weight among the remaining horses and started moving again, slower now, the wounded slowing them to a walk. The sun climbed toward noon and the heat built like a physical presence. Jack rode beside the travois, watching Ito's face for signs of shock or fever. Yamamoto walked on the other side, occasionally speaking to his injured comrade in low Japanese that sounded like comfort or prayer or both. Once Yamamoto said to Jack, "You are good doctor." "Where you learn?" Jack shrugged. "Ranch life," he said. "Out here you learn to doctor everything or you watch things die. Fixed up my share of breaks and wounds over the years, lost some, saved some. You do your best and hope it's enough." Yamamoto was quiet for a moment, then said, "My wife, she died when our daughter is small child. Bomb in Tokyo, American bomb 3 year ago. I angry for long time. Think American are devil, monster, everything propaganda say. But now I meet you and you are just man who fix broken leg of enemy, who give water in desert, who try to do right even when it's hard. Make me think maybe propaganda lie about everything. Maybe we all just men trying to live and government make us into enemy for their purpose." Jack felt the truth of it settle in his bones. That's about the size of it, he said. Men who never met deciding other men got to die, then wrapping it all up in flags and honor so we'll march when they say march. He paused, then added, I'm sorry about your wife. No parent should lose a child, and no child should lose a parent. Yamamoto nodded, his eyes distant. When war over, if I live, I try to find my daughter. Tell her about American cowboy who show mercy when world say to show none. Tell her maybe peace is possible if we choose to see human in enemy face. They stopped to rest in the thin shade of a lone cottonwood, everyone exhausted and the horses lathered despite the slow pace. Billy brought water to the prisoners without being asked, his movement still awkward but no longer hostile. He knelt beside Ito and helped him drink, and something in the careful way he supported the injured man's head spoke of a change happening beneath the surface, slow as erosion, but just as inevitable. Jack watched his son and felt a flicker of hope that maybe David's death wouldn't be the thing that destroyed Billy's capacity for compassion, that maybe instead it would teach him the preciousness of every life because he knew firsthand how quickly they could be stolen. Carson came over and said quietly, Folks gonna talk about this, you know, way you're treating these prisoners. Some won't understand. Jack nodded. Let them talk, he said. I got to live with myself long after their talking stops. That's always been the hardest audience to please. They spotted the Peterson Ranch just after 2 in the afternoon, its windmill and barn rising from the heat shimmer like a mirage made solid. Ito had developed a fever despite Jack's careful tending, his forehead hot to the touch and his breathing shallow and quick. They were still 4 hours from Camp Mexia at their current pace, and Jack made the call without hesitation, turning the group toward Peterson's place where there'd be shelter and the possibility of reaching a doctor by radio. Carson looked uncertain, but didn't argue, and Billy said nothing at all, just followed his father's lead the way he'd done as a boy before the war had taught him to question everything. They rode through the gate and into the yard where Sam Peterson stood on his porch with 2 other men Jack recognized from church socials and cattle auctions, all 3 of them going still and hard-eyed when they saw the prisoners. Sam came down off the porch slowly, his hand resting casual on the revolver at his hip, his face showing nothing but the kind of suspicion that comes easy to men who've spent the war years hearing nothing but propaganda about yellow devils and sneaking Japs. What in the hell are you doing, Jack? He said without preamble. Bringing enemy soldiers to my place like they're Sunday visitors? Jack dismounted and stood facing his neighbor, keeping his voice level and calm. Got a man with a broken leg gone fevered, he said. Need to get a doctor out here or he'll die, and I'd rather not have that on my conscience. Sam's eyes flicked to the travois where Ito lay pale and sweating, then back to Jack. Let him die, he said flatly. Saves us the trouble and the taxpayer money. One less Jap to feed and guard. The words hung in the air like something rotten. Jack felt Billy tense beside him, but his son stayed quiet, waiting to see how this would play. Jack took a breath and said, These men are prisoners under our protection. That means something, Sam, or it should. We don't let prisoners die from lack of care, not if we want to call ourselves civilized. One of the other men, a rancher named Hodges who'd lost a nephew at Guadalcanal, spat in the dust and said, Civilized? They weren't civilized at Pearl Harbor. Weren't civilized on the Bataan March when they worked our boys to death. Why should we show them mercy they never showed us? It was a fair question in its way, the kind of logic that made perfect sense if you never looked past the surface of things. Jack had heard it before, had thought it himself in the dark nights after David's telegram arrived. But he'd learned something in the days since finding these men dying in the desert, something about the difference between justice and revenge, between strength and cruelty. Before Jack could answer, Billy stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tension crackling through the yard like electricity before a storm. My brother died at Okinawa, he said, looking at Sam and then at Hodges. Died 3 months ago and I wanted someone to pay for that. Wanted it so bad I could taste it. He paused, his jaw working. These men here, they didn't kill David. They're just men who got caught up in the same war that took him. And letting this one die when we could save him, that don't honor David's memory. That just makes us into the thing we're supposed to be fighting against. The words came out raw and uncertain, like Billy was discovering what he believed even as he spoke it, but they had the weight of earned truth rather than easy platitude. Sam stared at Billy for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. "Your daddy put you up to saying that?" he asked. "Or you come to it yourself?" Billy shook his head. "Dad didn't tell me nothing I didn't have to learn the hard way," he said. "Spent 2 days riding with these prisoners, watching my father show them mercy when hate would have been easier. Watched him set that man's leg, knowing full well folks would judge him for it. And I realized something. David was a better man than me, always was. Kind and gentle and decent, even when the world gave him reasons not to be. He wouldn't want me turning into someone hard and mean just because he's gone. He'd want me to be the kind of man who does right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Jack felt something break open in his chest, pride and grief and relief all mixed together. Sam looked from Billy to Jack and back again, his face unreadable, the silence stretching out while everyone waited to see which way this would fall. Finally, Sam said, "Get the Jap into the bunkhouse. I'll radio for the camp doctor. But Jack, you're making a choice here that folks ain't gonna forget. You're choosing their side over ours." Jack met his old neighbor's eyes and said quietly, "I'm not choosing sides, Sam. I'm choosing to stay the kind of man who can look at himself in the mirror come morning. There's a difference." Sam made a sound that might have been disgust or grudging respect, impossible to tell which. He turned and went inside to make the radio call while his two companions stood watching with expressions that ranged from confusion to barely concealed contempt. Jack and Billy carefully lifted Ito from the travois and carried him into the bunkhouse, laying him on a cot while Yamamoto and Nakamura followed, their faces showing relief and worry in equal measure. Jack got Ito's boots off and covered him with a thin blanket, checking the splint to make sure the ride hadn't shifted anything. The fever was worse now, the man's skin dry and burning, his eyes moving beneath closed lids like he was dreaming or remembering or fighting battles that existed only in his head. Yamamoto knelt beside his injured friend and spoke softly in Japanese, words that sounded like comfort or prayer or perhaps just the simple human need to be heard by someone who understands. Then he looked up at Jack and said, "Why you do this? Risk friendship, risk reputation, for enemy you not know?" Jack was quiet for a moment, watching the sick man's labored breathing, thinking about all the sons and fathers and ordinary men who died in this war, thinking about David alone on some Pacific island and whether anyone had shown him kindness at the end. "Because the hardest thing I ever did was bury my son," he said finally. "Second hardest is not hating everyone who looks like the men who killed him. But hate's easy. Hate don't require courage. And I promised myself I'd live a life that required courage, even when it cost me everything I've built." Yamamoto's eyes glistened in the dim light of the bunkhouse. "In my country, we say true strength is in restraint," he said softly. "But we forget. Become the thing we fear. You remember what we forget. That make you stronger than sword, stronger than hate." The doctor arrived 2 hours later, a tired-looking captain from the camp medical unit who examined Ito with professional efficiency and gave grudging approval to Jack's field work. The break was clean and well set, he said. Fevers from shock and dehydration more than infection. Keep him still, keep fluids in him, and he should pull through. He left antibiotics and instructions and departed with barely concealed disapproval at the whole situation. As the sun set and long shadows filled the yard, Sam came out with coffee and cornbread, distributing it to everyone, including the prisoners. His face still hard, but his actions speaking louder than his words. They ate in uncomfortable silence while the stars came out overhead, vast and indifferent. The same stars that shone over Okinawa and Tokyo and every place where men had killed each other in the name of causes that seemed increasingly hollow the closer you got to the actual bleeding.